The winter of 1963 was one of the coldest London had seen in years. Frost clung to the windows of Sylvia Plath's flat at 23 Fitzroy Road, a small dim space that felt more like a cage than a home. She had chosen it because it held a strange kind of poetic irony. The same building where W.B. Yeats once lived, a man who had written of beauty and terror in equal measure. Now, it was her turn to wrestle with those same forces, alone. The days leading up to her death were marked by a chilling duality. On one hand, she was producing some of the most electrifying poetry of her career, raw, searing verses that would later become the backbone of Ariel. These were poems that burned with life even as they whispered of death, lines like, "Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well." But the act of creation could not keep the darkness at bay. She had been abandoned, first by Ted Hughes, who had left her for another woman, and then, it seemed, by the world itself. Friends visited less often now. The phone rarely rang. The flat was too quiet except for the cries of her children, Frida and Nicholas, who depended on her completely. She loved them fiercely, but love was not enough to fill the void that had opened inside her. Sleep became a stranger. She would lie awake for hours, listening to the wind howl outside, her mind racing with images of failure, of betrayal, of a future that seemed to shrink with each passing day. She had seen doctors, had been given pills, but the numbness they offered was not the kind of relief she wanted. She wanted to feel something, anything, other than this crushing weight. In her final letters, there were flashes of the old Sylvia, sharp, witty, alive. But between the lines, there was something else. Resignation. She wrote of plans, of manuscripts to be sent, of a future that, on paper, still existed. But the ink felt like a lie. The truth was in the poems, in the way they coiled around death like an old lover. On the night of February 10th, she put her children to bed with unusual care. She left milk and bread within reach, opened their window just enough to let in air, but not the cold. Then she sealed the kitchen door with wet towels, as if to contain what was about to happen. The gas oven hissed when she turned it on. She knelt, rested her head inside, and let the darkness take her. When the nurse arrived the next morning, the flat was silent except for the faint sound of the children stirring in their room. The smell of gas was thick in the air. The kitchen door, when pushed open, revealed Sylvia's body, still and final. The act had been deliberate, methodical, a last, desperate assertion of control in a life that had spiraled beyond her grasp. It was over. But in the way she died, careful to protect her children, meticulous in her final act, there was a terrible kind of love. And in the poems she left behind, there was something even more haunting. The voice of a woman who had stared into the abyss and written about it with unmatched brilliance, right up until the end. The dawn had not yet broken when the nurse arrived at 23 Fitzroy Road. A frigid stillness hung over the building, the kind that settles in just before the world wakes. Myra Norris, the hired help who came each morning to assist with the children, noticed nothing unusual at first, just the same dimly lit hallway, the same creak of the floorboards underfoot. But as she stepped further inside, a strange metallic scent caught in her throat. Gas. The realization came slowly, then all at once. The air was too thick, too sweet with it. She called out for Sylvia, but the flat swallowed her voice. No answer came, only silence. The children's door was slightly ajar. Inside, Frida and Nicholas slept undisturbed, their small chests rising and falling in the pale light, filtering through the open window. A mother's last act of mercy, fresh air for them, none for herself. Then, the kitchen. The door was shut, but something was wrong. Towels, damp, twisted, had been pressed along the base, sealing the gap between door and floor. Myra's hands shook as she turned the knob. The room beyond was a tomb. Sylvia lay on the floor, her head cradled in the oven, her dark hair spilling over the edge like ink. Her body was still warm, but there was no breath left in her. The gas still hissed softly from the open taps, a whisper of finality. Myra staggered back, gasping for air that wasn't poisoned. She rushed to the children, gathered them close, then ran for help. Neighbors were roused, a doctor summoned, but it was already too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, the flat was swarming with voices, with questions, with the awful, dawning understanding of what had happened. The police came next, moving through the scene with detached efficiency. They noted the absence of a suicide letter, the careful placement of the towels, the untouched milk and bread left for the children. A coroner would later call it a deliberate act, a mind made up. But those who knew Sylvia, who had read her words, who had seen the way she burned with life even in her darkest hours, would struggle to reconcile the woman they loved with the cold, methodical nature of her death. Outside, the sun rose over London, indifferent. The children were taken away, unharmed but forever marked. And in the kitchen, the oven door hung open, a black mouth that had swallowed one of the brightest voices of a generation. The official record states Sylvia Plath died by suicide on the morning of February 11th, 1963. But from the moment her body was discovered, whispers began, questions that would grow louder over decades, mutating into full-fledged theories, accusations, and myths. Her death became more than a tragedy. It became a battleground for interpretations, where poetry, feminism, and forensic uncertainty collided. The Missing Journal. A Silenced Voice. In the days after Plath's death, Ted Hughes claimed to have destroyed her final journal, the one that chronicled her last desperate months. He insisted he did it to protect their children, but the act was seen by many as a second death, an erasure of her final thoughts. What had she written in those pages? Rage? A confession? A plea? Without it, her last days remain half-lit, open to speculation. Some scholars believe the journal contained explosive material, perhaps even details about Hughes's affair with Asia Wevel, or darker revelations about their marriage. Others argue Hughes, himself a poet, couldn't bear the world reading his wife's unfiltered pain. Either way, the act cast a permanent shadow over his legacy. The Hughes factor, villain or scapegoat. Feminists of the 1970s, particularly Robin Morgan in her incendiary poem Arraignment, portrayed Hughes as a kind of literary Bluebeard, a man whose infidelity and emotional abandonment had pushed Plath to suicide. The fact that his mistress, Asia Wevel, would later kill herself and their 4-year-old daughter in an almost identical manner, Gas Oven, 1969, only deepened the narrative of a cursed, toxic influence. Hughes became a villain in the Plath mythology, his name repeatedly chiseled off her gravestone by outraged admirers. But was it fair? Some biographers argue that Plath's depression predated Hughes, that her suicide attempts began long before she met him, her first at age 20. Others point out that Hughes, though flawed, tirelessly promoted her work posthumously, ensuring Ariel was published as she intended. Still, his decision to edit her journals and control her estate left a bitter taste. Was it stewardship or censorship? The medical mystery. Could she have been saved? In her final weeks, Plath sought help from her doctor, John Horder. He prescribed antidepressants, but she was never hospitalized, despite her documented history of severe depression and suicide attempts. Could intervention have changed things? Some argue the medical establishment failed her, that her cries for help were downplayed as hysteria, a common dismissal of women's pain in that era. Others counter that Plath was highly functional until the end, writing, caring for her children, making her sudden suicide unpredictable even to those closest to her. The third person. Theory. an unlikely conspiracy. A fringe theory suggests Plath did not act alone. Some point to the odd placement of the towels, too meticulous, the lack of a suicide note, and Hughes's abrupt removal of her journal as possible red flags. Could there have been someone else in the flat that night? No evidence supports this, and most scholars dismiss it as sensationalism. But the rumor persists, fueled by the same cultural obsession that turns women's tragedies into mysteries. The legacy of Edith Plath's suicide became a Rorschach test. What people saw in it said more about them than her. To some, she was a martyr to patriarchal oppression. To others, a victim of her own genius, too sensitive for this world. Hughes spent the rest of his life dodging blame, even as he shaped her literary afterlife. And the readers? They kept searching for answers in her poems, as if the lines she wrote held a hidden clue. In the immediate aftermath of Sylvia Plath's death, the world reacted with the stunned silence of a stage after the tragic final act. The curtain had fallen, but the audience remained in their seats, unable to look away. Her body was quietly buried in Heptonstall, West Yorkshire, far from her American roots, under a headstone that would become a site of pilgrimage and vandalism. The words, Sylvia Plath Hughes, were chiseled into the stone, but over the years outraged admirers would repeatedly scratch out Hughes, as if by erasing Ted's name they could undo the marriage that had, in their eyes, destroyed her. The birth of a myth. Plath's death did something peculiar. It transformed her from a respected but struggling poet into an icon. The posthumous publication of Ariel in 1965 was a seismic event in literature. The poems, raw and electrifying, seemed to pulse with the very life force that had left her body. Readers devoured them, searching for clues, for answers, for some way to reconcile the woman who wrote, "I am vertical, but I would rather be horizontal," with the woman who had made that line a reality. She became a symbol of female creativity stifled by patriarchy, of mental illness misunderstood, of the tortured artist who burns too brightly to survive. Feminists adopted her as a martyr. Her suicide was framed not just as a personal tragedy, but as a political act, a direct result of the oppression of women in a male-dominated world. The fact that Ted Hughes, her estranged husband, controlled her literary estate only deepened the narrative of patriarchal silencing. Ted Hughes, the shadow in the aftermath. Hughes found himself in an impossible position. As Plath's executor, he was responsible for her literary legacy, but he was also, in the eyes of many, her killer by proxy. His editorial decisions, publishing Ariel but altering her intended order, destroying her last journal, were seen as acts of control, even censorship. When he published Birthday Letters in 1998, a collection of poems addressing their relationship and her death, it was both a confession and a defense, a decades-latent attempt to have his say. The tragic irony was that Hughes, too, was haunted. His lover, Assia Wevel, killed herself and their child in 1969 in a horrifying echo of Plath's death. His sister Alwyn, who helped manage Plath's estate, became a polarizing figure, accused of suppressing unflattering material. The Hughes family seemed cursed, trapped in the narrative of Sylvia's suicide, like characters in a Greek tragedy. The children. Living with the ghost. Frida and Nicholas Hughes grew up in the shadow of their mother's myth. Nicholas, a marine biologist, avoided the literary world entirely, refusing interviews until his own suicide in 2009, a chilling parallel that only deepened the sense of a family doomed by its own genius. Frida, an artist and poet, has spoken sparingly but poignantly about her mother, resisting the public's hunger for tragedy. "I don't want to be the custodian of their ashes," she once said, rejecting the role of grieving daughter as performance. The cultural phenomenon. Plath's life and death have inspired plays, films, novels, and endless academic debate. The 2003 film Sylvia, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, was criticized for romanticizing her suffering, reducing her to a doomed beauty rather than the fierce intellect she was. Every year, new biographies attempt to solve her, as if her suicide were a riddle to be cracked rather than the complex, messy reality it was. Her work, meanwhile, has only grown in stature. The Bell Jar, once dismissed as melodramatic, is now a cornerstone of feminist literature, a piercing depiction of a young woman's unraveling. Ariel is taught in classrooms worldwide, its poems dissected for their technical brilliance as much as their biographical resonance. The enduring question, why does she still captivate? Perhaps it's because Plath's story refuses to fit neatly into any narrative. She was a victim, but also a victor, her words outliving her body. She was a feminist icon, but also a woman who, in her darkest moments, saw no way out. She was a genius who wrote, "I think I made you up inside my head," about her father, only to have millions of readers do the same to her. In the end, Sylvia Plath's legacy is not just her poetry, nor her death, but the way the two intertwine, an unbreakable bond between art and agony, between the woman who wrote "Dying is an art" and the woman who, in the end, mastered it too well. The flame of her life was extinguished in that cold London flat, but the sparks she left behind still burn, brighter than ever. The morning Sylvia Plath died, London was frozen under a layer of February frost. The cold seeped into walls, into bones, but not into the words she left behind. Those remained molten, alive, burning through the decades with undiminished intensity. Her death at 30 should have been an ending, but instead, it became a kind of terrible beginning. The moment Sylvia Plath, the woman, became Sylvia Plath, the myth, the martyr, the voice of a generation's silent scream. There is something unbearable about genius extinguished too soon. We look at the life she might have lived, the poems unwritten, the children unheld, the self she might have become, and we ache for the loss. But Sylvia had already seen the shape of her own ending. In Lady Lazarus, written months before her death, she taunted, "Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well." And she did. Her suicide was not a cry for help, but a performance perfected. The oven sealed like a stage, the children safe in the wings, the world waiting beyond the curtain. She had rehearsed this before, at 20, when she swallowed pills and hid beneath her mother's house. That time, she was found. This time, she made sure she wouldn't be. Yet for all her meticulous control over her death, she could not control what came after. She became a symbol she might have hated. The tortured poetess, the woman who loved too much, the victim of a man's cruelty. Ted Hughes bore the brunt of the blame, but the truth was always more complicated. Sylvia's darkness was hers long before Ted entered the picture, a dark thing that slept in her, as she wrote, all day like a bat. But here is the miracle. The poems survived. Ariel roared into the world 2 years after her death, a final, furious gift. The Bell Jar escaped the pseudonym Victoria Lucas and became a Bible for women who saw their own suffocation in its pages. Even in death, Sylvia refused to be erased. Why we keep returning to her? We read Sylvia Plath not to understand her death, but to understand her life, that relentless, radiant, unbearable life. She wrote about the agony of existence with such clarity that it became beautiful. She took the private terror of depression and made it universal. In her words, we recognize our own darkest hours, but also our own capacity to transform pain into art. There is a moment in The Bell Jar when Esther Greenwood says, "I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am, I am, I am." That is Sylvia's real epitaph. Not the grave in Heptonstall, not the gas oven, but those 5 defiant words. I am, I am, I am. She was. She is. And through her words, she always will be. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.